Hi, you've tuned into CKUW 95.9 FM here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I'm Tammy Wolf, the host of Truth Before Reconciliation. I have Albert McLeod here with me today. He is the president of Two-Spirited People of Manitoba, as well as one of the incoming co-chairs for the Manitoba Coalition on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and Two-Spirited People. In lieu of today's date, October 4th, we are going to be talking a little bit about Two-Spirit People and how they've integrated into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirited People, and as well as the events that are happening throughout the city and the province here in Manitoba. So I'd like to welcome you, Albert.
Thank you, Tammy.
Thank you so much for being here.
Great.
Did you maybe want to start by introducing yourself, telling the listeners a little bit about yourself before we have a little chat?
Sure. I was born in a small village of Cormorant, Manitoba, which is north of the Pas, Manitoba, and I lived there till I was 19 years of age. My family have a very blended colonial history of people who immigrated from Scotland to be part of the Hudson Bay fur trade, as well as the Indigenous people who also lived in northern Manitoba who worked in the Hudson Bay fur trade as well. So there's about 7 generations of us who have that heritage. And I live in Winnipeg and do a lot of work around Indigenous identity, the Two-Spirit community, as well as I work with Roger Roulette, who's an Ojibwe language specialist in authenticating Indigenous practice and philosophies.
Very interesting work. I know that we had met, you had done a panel discussion at the University of Winnipeg here, and very informative. It's so interesting, especially within my own research as women's studies, I guess, or specifically Indigenous women in Canada, and seeing that integration of that Two-Spirit values, who we are as Indigenous people. So I thought maybe we could explore that a little bit more in regards to the inquiry. Did you maybe want to tell the story of like how that came to be?
Well, I think, when the inquiry got its mandate from Parliament, and initially the previous government did not have the inquiry on their horizon, quote unquote, and then the following government did, support an inquiry. So that process began. And the initial wording of the mission or mandate of that inquiry was Indigenous woman, which if you think sort of, historically, it is a colonial definition of what in modern, 20th, 21st century, what constitutes quote unquote an Indigenous woman. But through the process of the inquiry, after a couple of years, they began to include trans Indigenous women, which was a reflection of the past, understanding that, historically there was multiple gender roles in various nations across Turtle Island. And so it was slowly becoming more historically accurate, more socially accurate in how, the woman's role or the woman's identity was much more broader than what colonists understood, like, our parliament understood. So, midway through, Two-Spirit People were included primarily through trans female identities. And then towards the end of the inquiry, in the final report, there were 32 specific calls for justice for 2S LGBTQIA people. And that really demonstrated that a better or more authentic reflection of how Indigenous people saw gender as being a much broader representation of male and female than sort of the binary that is presented in a colonial context.
Right. And I mean, really looking like a little bit more deeply at that, I mean, my understanding is that, we didn't see gender, right? It was more about roles, right? Yeah. Roles and how those people interacted in regards to their work roles, what they would do in the community, correct?
Yeah, and Roger Roulette says, that indigenous sort of values or, philosophies are around pragmatism, common sense, and reason, and that
Right.
guides the how
Yeah.
society functions, and that that every child born had a purpose, a role, a
Mhm.
destiny, and possessed a divine gift, and that that parents did not interfere with the creation of their child in the sense that if
Right.
that child was gay or lesbian or trans, they could not interfere in that, right? Because
Right.
that being came from the spiritual realm, and
For
that
sure.
its path had already been negotiated or developed from the spiritual realm. So for humans to interfere with that was really a social taboo. And
Right.
after colonists came here and the Indian residential school era, all of those teachings and beliefs were obliterated and
Right.
became, something corrupt or something evil. And that's the damage that those schools had done, is
Very much
that they
so.
impose this binary on indigenous minds and indigenous structures.
Right. And I mean, really, those roles had little to do. I mean, well, from my research that I've conducted, it talked less about like the sexual aspect. It
Yeah.
wasn't, and that really was where the church infiltrated and imposed their I mean, I want to say sexualized ideas on these gender roles because they were about roles rather than sexuality.
But I think it was also the hypocrisy of the churches in that many of the children were exposed to sexual violations in these
Right.
schools.
In the
So on
church,
one side,
exactly.
and they were, and when we talk about truth, many of these children had to carry a lie. They had to, pretend
Right.
it wasn't happening, and it was the adults who did that to them.
Right.
Where they couldn't tell the truth to their parents when they went home, that they had experienced, whether it was physical, mental, or sexual abuse, because they
Right.
knew they were going back to these schools. And so it's that sort of, what is the truth and what is the lie, and how the church was involved in that, that
Right.
on one sense, they were talking about moral purity, yet some of them were abusing these children.
Right.
And so they were creating this lie, right? That many of the children had to carry for their whole lives.
For sure. And I mean, really just eradicating a very important role within our communities and our societies as Indigenous people.
Well, I think if you look back at colonialism around the world, and diverse gender roles and understandings of sexuality were evident in many indigenous societies around the world, like India, Australia, the Philippines, New Zealand, South America. And it's only after colonization you see the misogyny, the violence against women, right?
Right.
The femicide,
Patriarchy.
yeah,
Hmm.
patriarchy. And I think that misogyny goes hand in hand with colonization,
For
and
sure.
that it was a disruption of the women's, authority, their roles in governing. And so that and men who were perceived as being feminine were classed in the same thing, right? That it
Right.
was even more, I think, offensive to the early settlers that a man would choose to represent as female, right? Because
Mhm.
their focus was on authority, power, and militarization. And
Right.
so the erasure of these roles was, part of colonization around the world. And it's, communities are coming back, but slowly, slowly.
Right.
We still live in a very patriarchal world where there is
Very
still
much
a lot of
so.
misogyny. And but I think, when, you know, nations come out from under the thumb of colonization, and that's why I call, this is the two-spirit resurgence in the 21st
Right.
century, that, after, tens of thousands of years of social development, we are pretty sophisticated, complex people, right?
Right.
And now we are picking up the thread left by our ancestors after 500 years. And I truly believe that our ancestors left a lot. Like, I think they understood the implications of colonization, But in doing so, I think they left a lot of tools for us when we come out the other side. And I believe we are coming out of the other side right now.
For sure. I mean, I feel like, you know, you talking about picking up those traditional roles, we're there's still shreds of who we were before the impacts of
Yeah.
colonization, right? And so we can see that kind of resurgence in our culture and with our two-spirited people. So how do you feel that plays into the truth-telling process?
Well, I think it is, you know, I think there's a lot of trauma, a lot of stigma, a lot of anxiety about dealing with anti-Indigenous racism and the ongoing genocide in Canada. I think
Right,
from both sides, right? And it is, you know, like Two-Spirit people, we go through a lot. Like we go through the erasure of identities, the ongoing homophobia and transphobia. But in doing that, we're very strong people. We're very, you know, intelligent. Many of us are lawyers. Many of us have PhDs. Right?
right.
Many of us are running organizations in North America. So
Mm,
we understand sort of the processes of dealing with historic trauma and violence and coming through that. And I think that sort of polarization of the Indigenous male and female gender identity has created that gap, right,
right,
where the violence can persist. And I think that's what the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Women and Girls had done, is that it inserted us in the gap, right,
right. Yeah,
as a solution to the violence, because we have a different perspective around social dynamics,
right,
around violence, around gender roles, you know, the power of gender roles, and decolonization with systems like universities,
right.
you know, medical institutions, legal systems, right? So, and like I said, some of us are lawyers, so we know those systems very well. So I think it is an opportunity to bring in new ideas, fresh ideas on how we can move forward, but using the foundation that predates colonization, right?
Right.
That we didn't exclude people, right? We acknowledged everybody's individual gifts and that their creation was for a reason,
For
right?
sure.
And it's to support the family, it's to support the community. And like in Treaty 3, they created a Two-Spirit Governance Council. So they're not just talking about it, they're doing it, right? They're
Mhm.
including Two-Spirit people as part of their, you know, how they govern as a people. And so they're really reclaiming something that would have existed in pre-contact times.
Right. And I mean, really looking at that from, you know, comparing it to, say, women's studies, right? And we look at our Indigenous women as, you know, being so important and highly respected because of that gift, that life-giving ability.
Yep, yeah.
But when we're looking at two-spirit people, it's looked at as a gift as well. Those, it almost, I mean, I want to say in conjunction or the same, because nobody was above or below anybody. That was the gift that two-spirit people had to give, and we can see that reclamation of that gift and how, you know, you're talking about those strengths. Like, that's all I can think of is the courage and the strength, you know, to move beyond what happened, the negative impacts with patriarchy and colonization and trying to eradicate and say this is not who you should be, right? And then still coming back so powerful and so strong with, yeah, with such, you know, strength. It's super
Well,
powerful to watch.
yeah, and working with Roger, he says one of the key principles is faith and belief. And, you
Mm-hmm.
know, we work with many communities today who don't have any terminology or words that describe Two-Spirit people in the language. But Roger
Okay.
says that's because those terms have become archaic, in that
Mm-hmm.
due to the lack of usage, because they were taboo words, right?
Right,
If there was a Catholic priest within hearing distance, you would
right.
not say those words because they were taboo, right? Being
Mm-hmm.
homosexual or lesbian or trans for over 150 years was taboo.
Right.
So those words were forgotten. And there's a few that remain, right? But again, people were intimidated to not to speak the language, to
Right.
not use those words that describe that diversity of gender. So there isn't a memory, cultural memory, that
Right.
Two-Spirit people existed, right? So we always lapse into the binary Adam and Eve, and the ideal man, the ideal female,
Right.
and then that's where, as Two-Spirit people, we get pushback to say, well, you're a result of colonization, and the Europeans brought this idea to Indigenous people, and that's a false understanding because it's evident around the world, right?
Right.
Where
Right.
some societies still have those words and roles, like in
There is.
India, right?
Mhm.
So it is, educating our communities about that truth of our own history, and
Right.
that there is a place for us, and that, we cannot accept homophobia and transphobia because we see the poverty, the homelessness, and even, suicides among Two-Spirit people in Canada and the US because they feel rejected by their communities.
Right.
And, if we say
Just
we're going to move
yeah.
forward with truth and reconciliation healing, it has to apply to everybody.
Right. Well, I mean, really looking at that, how Indigenous people are, I mean, internally colonized. We believe these stereotypes, these stigmas, these stories that were told to us from colonization, throughout colonization. Things basically saying you can't be who you are because we're telling you that that's not okay. But really, going back to the language aspect, I believe I did a presentation one time comparing traditional Indigenous women's roles to Two-Spirit people and masculinity, male roles. And I think through the research that I did, I think there was 7 different roles, 7 different words to describe the
Yep.
role of Two-Spirit people in Cree, in the Cree
Yeah.
language.
Yeah.
Just mind blowing, right?
Yeah. And the thing is, they're not in everyday usage.
Right.
So how do we bring those back? And like as a child, I started to learn how to sew, which is a female type, role, on my
Mm-hmm.
grandmother's treadle sewing machine. And I made clothes for my friends' dolls.
Mm-hmm.
So growing up in the PA in the 60s, that was, not usually what little boys did. They were
Right.
interested in cars and hockey and all of that,
The
but
I
that was
chose.
not and my thing was that was a normal alignment with my grandmother, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if I was a trans male or a lesbian woman, her alignment might be with her grandfather, which is,
Right.
chopping wood or going hunting. And in the Cree culture in those days, my parents, because they spoke the language, they knew they could not interfere with me because
Right.
the language told them I was who I was supposed to be,
Right.
which was the little boy who liked to sew. And
Right.
their ethics, which were embedded in their mind through the language, told them that they could not interfere with that because that was from the spiritual world,
For
right?
sure.
And it changed later, like in the 70s and 80s, that understanding began to evaporate, right? Because
Right.
the more people were speaking, more that
Right.
generation didn't speak the language.
It's so interesting, these ideas that you're bringing here, when you talk about language, I have a theory about residential schools and I guess the taking of our language away from us, right? I honestly believe that they took our spirits when they took our language. The more that I learn my language as an Inuit, I
Yeah,
I I understand more. I feel like I'm more connected to who I am, my identity, my culture, my true spirit of who I am. And when I think about them eradicating our language and taking it from our children, and seeing that and how negative those impacts were,
yeah.
I truly believe they took our spirits from us because
Well, that severing or cutting away is a violent process. It
right,
seems benign to restrict people, Indigenous children, from speaking their language and forcing them to speak English, but psychologically, it is very damaging.
It is.
And like my mother was in a day school in South Indian Lake, and when she spoke Cree, she was strapped, right?
Right.
And that affected her perception of formal education. You know, she
Right.
didn't trust teachers, she didn't trust educators. And when we
Mhm.
were in high school, when we were facing, racism, when we wanted to quit school, she didn't encourage us to stay.
Right.
Right. And I think there's only 2 of us in our family who graduated from high school out of 6. So how that goes from one generation to the next, it has great implications about, the attempt to eradicate the language and the
Mhm.
very deep, discrete meanings with embedded in these languages. Like the languages describe a vibrant, colorful world that is many times very funny and humorous, right?
Right.
And that's
That's
what's
where
missing.
our
That's what
humor
people don't
is.
understand about English, right?
They
It's
don't.
not as funny.
Well,
And
it's
that
funny
life
because
can be like
it,
life can be exciting and strange and funny
yes.
and all of that. And I think people don't realize that humor is part of our survival, right?
Yes, definitely. I think it's so funny that you bring that up because I remember with my master's program, one of the mandatory, you have to take a language credit. So there was a non-Indigenous girl who was in my program with me in a Cree classroom, and I tried to tell her "Matia was." she was like, well, that's rude. She's like, when I told her what it meant, she was like,
Yeah.
that's so rude. I wouldn't. I'm gonna like tell Ida, the instructor, I'm gonna like tell Ida Matia was. She's like, that's so rude. I would never say that to her. I'm like,
Yeah.
she doesn't get it. She doesn't
Yeah.
understand Cree culture,
Yeah.
right? But
And
so
that's what Roger
good.
talks about, like as an Ojibwe language specialist and the translator, like translators need to know the nuances of English
Mhm.
just as much as they need to know the nuances of Ojibwe or Cree, right?
Right, for
And
sure.
that's why they're so specialized, because they have that ability, they have that gift to do that, right? To do those levels of translation interpretation of what
Right,
the sort of true meaning is.
for sure.
So yeah, so I think the truth is, and for myself, I was involved in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process in
Right.
the 5 years that it was active, and I had hoped it would, attempt to, untangle that sort of imposition of the binary on children who were in these schools, because
Right.
they were in segregated dormitories based on the state and the church's perception of a colonial gender, which was the
Mhm.
ideal male, ideal female. And it didn't actually pinpoint that as a way forward, which I was disappointed. But I am glad that the inquiry into MMIWG did do that and expanded that definition of Indigenous woman.
They definitely tried it, and we can
Yeah.
see that now that it is being integrated, especially too with my research. I know that I included 2S. That is a gap that we've all recognized that we do need to keep that, I guess, that continued throughout MMIWG 2S. So I guess we are kind of on the second half of the show here. So getting closer to the end, I thought maybe we would talk a little bit about today's event. So it is October 4th, the provincial day here in Manitoba that we honor and recognize our missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. So did you want to talk about some of the events that's happening today?
Yeah, there is a vigil at the Odina Center in the evening. There's also a sacred fire in the morning. And just a sec here. In Selkirk, they're going to be launching a mural that day as well. And one of the artists there is part of the MMIWG coalition, co-chairs. And then there's going to be a run and a walk Souls on Fire, it's called.
Sure.
Beginning at the monument at the Odina Circle at 4:30 on that day as well. And then I'm not sure, it's a legislative building.
I believe they do
Yeah.
have something every year. I'm usually at that one.
Yeah.
Are they? Yeah. Because I know Bernadette isn't doing her event, but I believe they're the 6 p.m. vigil at the monument at the Forks this evening. I think Nahani's been involved in that.
Yeah, and in the PAW, there's a red dress display happening at the PAW Family Resource Center. And in Thompson, there's a memorial walk and candlelight vigil in the evening vigil at McLean Park.
Perfect. So I will be posting a poster with all of the events on the page. You can actually go to the page now. The poster's already been updated. So you can see all of those events, the times, the places. Please wear your red shirts today in support. Lovely display last week, Thursday, with the orange shirts. We had such a wonderful turnout at the powwow. I would love to see that same energy. I would love to see that same support for our missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. I'm wearing my shirt today for my mother. For those of you, if you want to go to the Truth Before Reconciliation page, I'll be posting the video with the video of today's interview. But I did want to, I guess, maybe say suggestions, ask you, Albert, what your suggestions would be for the listeners out there who want to get involved. I guess besides wearing their red shirts and going to the events today, what can people do to get involved in regards to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people?
Well, I think it is, we have a lot of historical documents that have guided us to this place. Like we have the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996, and they recommended an Indigenous Parliament. Could you imagine where we would be today as Indigenous people or as Canadians if we had an Indigenous Parliament that was functioning since 1996? Then we had the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, which reported on the murder of Helen Betty Osborne and some of those recommendations. And so then we have the TRC 94 calls to action. And I think it would be learning about the 231 calls for justice. And it is a process. And when you merge 231 calls for justice with 94 calls for action, that's a lot of work, right?
It is very much so.
But for myself, these commissions and inquiries are for Canadians, right? Indigenous people understand these historical things that have occurred, but Canadians don't. So I think for Canadians, for them, these reports are for them to understand, this is your country, this is your history, this is what happened to Indigenous people by legislation, by policy. Much of it was anti-Indigenous racism. So as a Canadian, we live in a first world country. How do we address that disparity? Right. And why do people have benefits and privileges and others don't? And those two extremes cannot exist in the same place. And that's what this is about. It's learning. It's learning the truth of the past, reconciling it in your mind and changing things, right? And learning about, many Canadians don't even know where the closest reserve is. Some people are living on a reserve in Canada, and they don't even know that, right? So it really is consciousness raising, and that Indigenous people, like we have, in Canada, they say there's like two founding nations, like France and Canada, the British. It's not true. There's the Indigenous nations. Right. And it's just creating that consciousness. So yeah, it's a learning curve for everybody, but I think primarily for non-Indigenous people to begin to read these documents and understand the implications of them, that it's a new day.
For sure.
We're changing as a society. And if we want to stand with the other societies around democracy and freedom and justice, we need to get there. We're not there yet, but we need to get there as a society, and resolving the issues that confront Indigenous people every day is part of that direction.
Right. Such wonderful words of wisdom, Albert. Thank you so much for that. I can't mirror that enough. I know throughout, if you're always tuning into my show, I know that you have heard of those documents before, the RCAP report, the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, the 94 calls to action, and then the 231 calls for justice, the MMIWG report that was just released June 2019. So all of those reports, such great documents to go out and really dig deep and look at how all of those documents kind of like they built on each other, right? And so it's such a great suggestion from you, Albert, for people out there. That's, you know, that's your role and responsibility to get out there and know your history as a Canadian, right? So thank you so much, Albert. I wish we had more time. We've run out of time, but I want to thank you so much for coming in today, and hopefully see you later today at one of the events.
Great, thank you, Tammy. It's been great.
So I hope you guys enjoyed today's show. Please do come down to the events today, hopefully to see you at Souls on Fire, 4:30 at the Forks today. You are still listening to CKUW 95.9 FM here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I'm Tammy Wolf, the host of Truth Before Reconciliation. Thanks again, Albert McLeod, for coming in.
Great.
Hopefully you guys come back next week.
Bye.